The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay. Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on GDPR compliance, getting everybody on board. My name is Stephanie and I will be delivering the session today. I will introduce myself and explain my role in a bit more detail later, but before that I'd like to go through some technical details. So I hope you can all hear. You are all set to mute, so if I can't hear you, that's normal. And during the presentation, you can, however, ask questions through simply typing them into the app's UI, and I will then address them at the end when we've got time for Q&A. Regarding the slides, they will be distributed to you via email after this, and you can also refer to our blog or contact any of my colleagues in the service centre if you have further questions which come to you after the presentation. So firstly, I just want to say I recognise that there will be varying levels of knowledge on both the GDPR and employee engagement within this audience. So I have aimed to make this quite digestible for an audience with diverse backgrounds. And it's mainly a common sense type of approach to employee engagement and the GDPR. However, it is based on the assumption that audiences have a basic understanding of the GDPR and its key implications for businesses, because at the end of the day, it's not a webinar about the GDPR itself, really. So, before we start, let's have a quick overview of the structure of this webinar and what we're going to look at. We're going to start with a brief introduction on IT governance and the different types of solutions we offer. Apologies if you have seen this in a previous webinar, but I think it's important to provide some background on our organizational context. Then we're going to talk about staff awareness and the GDPR and look at why it's important and general things to consider and look out for. We will then move on to stakeholders, focus groups and planning, which in my view is really key to getting everyone on board with the GDPR and getting your workforce to work for you towards compliance in a sense. Then we will talk about managing change, which is also really a key aspect when it comes to GDPR and staff awareness and compliance as well. Later on, we will talk about common challenges which organizations face when it comes to the GDPR and engaging your workforce. And we will then move on to examining proven techniques and solutions to address these challenges. Obviously, every organization is different and has its unique challenges. So this is by no means a kind of one-size-fits-all proposed solution or approach that can be universal, but I think it's a good starting point with some practical advice on how to approach employee engagement. So again, although we are talking about the GDPR, This webinar won't be so much about things like risk registers, DPIAs, although they are related and they are important, but more about the human factor involving effective communications and people management. So while we should obviously adhere to things like privacy by design and structure our processes in a way to facilitate compliance and drive compliance, at the end of the day, the people do really matter in your organization. So that's what this will be all about. So about IT governance and a brief introduction from myself as well. IT governance is a so-called one-stop shop for everything risk and compliance, governance, information security. We have subject matter experts in many different subjects, ranging from PCI DSS to the GDPR, information security, and much more. We have 15 years of experience. We are constantly growing. We have many different clients in different countries. And we also provide many different training solutions on a lot of the subjects we deal with, not only digitally, but also face-to-face across different countries and different languages. So a bit about myself. I'll make this short because I've already introduced myself. I'm a learning design and solutions consultant. I have international cross-sector experience. I have worked for the public sector in training and development. I have worked for many different areas in the private sector, again, across different countries, with different sort of subject matter specific and sector specific challenges, delivering both digital and face-to-face training. So staff awareness and the GDPR, kind of why it matters. It's very simple. There is a clear correlation between levels of employee engagement and risk of breaches in data protection, as well as information security and other fields, but data protection we're talking about mainly here. And this is why getting your workforce on board is so important, and staff awareness is so important with such a sensitive subject. So here we've got the very bare kind of GDPR mention of awareness in the tasks of the data protection officer. We've got to monitor compliance with this regulation, with other union member state data protection provisions, and with the policies of the controller or processor in relation to the protection of personal data, including the assignment of responsibilities, awareness raising, and training of staff involved in processing operations and related audits. So while this is within the remit of the tasks of the data protection officer, in reality it is not something you can leave to this role or to compliance managers and even legal experts to deal with, while the rest of the organization can just carry on as normal, because everyone who deals with personal data in any way, as you will have learned from the GDPR in general, which is very vast, everyone will be affected, and this needs to be clear to all employees throughout any organization, really. So why it matters. While it's a task of the data protection officer, when you read this ICO publication, preparing for the general data protection regulation, they have 12 steps to take now, and the very first step on this sequence is actually awareness, and that is really common sense, but is all too often overlooked or viewed as a mere kind of tick box exercise to be completed, rather than taking care of it thoroughly. Now moving on to stakeholders, focus groups and planning. So as I mentioned, while the data protection officer, compliance managers, quality managers and legal specialists are very important players, they should by no means lead your staff awareness strategy regarding the GDPR by themselves, because there are so many more angles and important considerations from other departments to take into account. So if you want to build a real culture of compliance and get everybody on board, you will need to extend the planning and the involvement far beyond those departments. There is a little kind of anecdotal example about compliance managers frequently asking about tools like meta compliance or net consent. And while they are very effective tools developed sort of by compliance specialists for compliance specialists, they are by no means as valuable from an HR perspective, from a change management perspective, or from an internal communications perspective. So it's very important to adopt a holistic approach and get everybody involved. So here I have put together a list of the really essential crowd who should be sitting at the table when you discuss your staff awareness and engagement strategy for the GDPR. We've got the C-suite, senior management. There's this whole idea of leading by example, so this top-down approach where they should act as role models and really push employee engagement and push the importance of the GDPR on everybody's agenda. We've got DPOs, information security staff, then business process owners. This is perhaps not so much from an engagement point of view, but for other obvious reasons, they should always be part of your discussions around the GDPR. We have HR, change management, and internal communications. So we will talk about this in a bit more detail, but essentially it's important to recognize that it's a people-focused strategy on one hand, rather than just compliance, and that they are intrinsically linked. And these kind of departments can make sure that even the kind of shop floor workforce or manufacturing line workforce will also be aligned with the ideas and the strategy of the organization regarding the GDPR. Sorry. There was a little bit more about planning I wanted to say. Essentially, you can use a number of different strategies to assess where your organization stands regarding employee engagement and the GDPR. You can use different qualitative and quantitative techniques, which we will see in a bit when we look at the needs analysis. But first, we will move on to managing change. So essentially, the GDPR is a change management topic and should be very high on every change manager's agenda. I often see that in larger organizations, it is led by change management rather than compliance. However, all too often in small organizations, the sort of data protection function is left alone with all of these tasks, including the awareness strategy, which should ideally really not be the case. So often, as a result, managers are left with dealing with resistance to the GDPR, and it's really a very natural reaction from your employees because at the end of the day, aversion to change is natural. However, if you understand resistance and aversion to change and change management a bit better, then you can perhaps borrow some strategies from this and apply it to your GDPR awareness training. So there is, on one hand, resistance to content of change, and on the other hand, resistance to the process. To give you an example, that's perhaps not GDPR specific, imagine you are introducing some new operating systems, a new version of Windows or something like that, and people will be opposed to it because they like the old version. However, they may not necessarily be opposed to the new version, as the new version may be easier to use, more intuitive, or better for the business. They may only be opposed to the process of changing to the new system. And that can be very similar with the GDPR, meaning that it's not the content people are opposed to because they understand common sense, best practice, and good approaches to data protection, which the GDPR is essentially. But it's more resistance to the process of change leading to the adoption of the GDPR, meaning that people view it as a hindrance to productivity, or people simply think it's going to take too much time to adopt and to become compliant. So when trying to manage resistance, just consider this question in the context of your organization. So managing the transition to the GDPR through organization-wide buy-in. When you plan your approach and you plan how to engage your employees and get them on board, it is firstly important to understand your audiences. So depending on the sector you operate in and your organization, you may have a very young workforce, you may have a very mobile workforce, perhaps an international workforce, and these are all very important considerations to take into account before addressing your workforce and before trying to get everyone on board, to analyze their needs and preferences in a sense and how they would react. And this in turn is a question of aligning your strategy and your culture from a more general point of view, meaning that whatever strategy you deploy for compliance and for employee engagement with the GDPR should be tailored to your culture, ultimately. The idea of reading and rewriting the context, again, is a concept from change management. And you can read a great deal about this on the CIPD's website, which I will show you in a second in useful references. And it is basically the idea of understanding resistance, understanding problems that arise, and addressing them in a very targeted manner, and changing your employees' view by using proven sort of learning and development techniques, which we will look at in more detail in a bit as well. And finally, and this is quite important, be opportunistic. By this I mean that don't be afraid to piggyback certain parts of your awareness strategy onto other programs which have been successful, and be careful to identify important windows of opportunity in terms of time of the year, times when people are less busy, to push your GDPR awareness agenda. Bringing about a change in mindset. So it's this very common saying of winning hearts and minds, and to attain the highest levels of employee engagement, it is important to generate personal investment and motivation for adopting the GDPR. So The hearts and minds usually refers to people's emotional drivers as well as their rational drivers. So on one hand, people have to recognize that the GDPR is good and has its benefits and protects your organization. But on the other hand, they also have to invest themselves to an extent personally and care about it on a more personal level rather than on a community or organizational level. And this is the idea of overcoming the fact that individuals view the GDPR and compliance in general as a hindering hurdle to productivity, really, and to attain the highest levels of long-term engagement and also knowledge retention and application, it is important to drive continuous personal investment to the GDPR. The common challenges organizations face, and some of them you may be familiar with and others may be new to you, perhaps because you haven't quite faced them yet or because you operate in a different sector, but we will go through them and then look at some solutions. So the GDPR as a focal subject, even though legal experts and many different people are very excited by the GDPR as a subject, it can often be viewed as dry and also overwhelming and too content heavy, as well as overly abstract or complex to the wider audience without a legal background, without a compliance background. So that often there are misconceptions regarding the GDPR and its implications. So you often hear, for example, I don't deal with personal data, so it doesn't affect me, even though in reality, as defined by the GDPR, that this person will deal with personal data. Or often, as I said, they don't even know how personal data is defined by the GDPR. Or they will think IT is responsible for it. So there's a whole wide array of different misconceptions which need to be addressed regarding the subject, and they are often the driver for resistance as well, because if you don't understand something, you don't want to adopt it, you don't want to delve any further into this subject. Another common issue with the GDPR and employee engagement is the difference between a training audit trail and true engagement and behavior change. So often for compliance purposes, it's important to provide a reliable audit trail, for example, through offering an e-learning, which IT governance also provide, and we have a very high quality GDPR training course which users can take online from anywhere in the world. And this can be measured, and completion rates and scores and things like that can be reported, which is very important. However, it does not provide a holistic image of true engagement and behavior change. So a lot of research recently has found that even though employees have the necessary knowledge and level of awareness, they do not necessarily apply it on their everyday job. And that can be due to different factors, but it's important to anticipate this and to address it through kind of continuous improvement of your program and your engagement with your workforce regarding the GDPR. Now let's look at some proven techniques and solutions. Essentially, the answer really is to build a culture of compliance with the GDPR, but there are different parts to this. So as mentioned in your planning stage, analysis is really, really important. It's important to identify common drivers for resistance or gaps in understanding as a first step to gaining organization-wide buy-in. So you can do this in many different ways. You can have a pre-assessment, for example. You can have focus groups. You can have qualitative interviews with heads of departments and really get a clear image of your organization's perception of the GDPR and common issues with it before addressing them in a targeted way. Another solution is the implementation of a GDPR awareness program. So rather than just delivering a single piece of training or e-learning, you can have kind of staggered full-scale program to address the needs of your audience through different stages and to make sure it's maintained in the long term. So the benefit of this is that it can be delivered through multiple different channels, and obviously the broader the better, and the more members of your workforce you will engage. Now, gaining buy-in. Don't treat the GDPR awareness training like a bitter medicine that everyone needs to swallow. And this is not just true to the GDPR, but to many different compliance training and awareness pieces. Project owners are often apologetic, so they apologize to their workforce for having to complete this training, which really should not be the case. They should really encourage senior managers to lead by example and adopt a positive attitude and really sell the GDPR internally. And this can be done through emphasizing the consequences of non-compliance, but it should also focus on the benefits that the GDPR brings. And we all know about the shocking fines, and for employees, this can be a driver, or it can be convincing, but it can also seem a bit too abstract, or not necessarily generate the impact or results and the desired scare factor which CEOs may have. So yeah, in brief, it should not be a kind of we have to do it attitude. It should be a selling the benefits kind of approach. A brief example of this can be seen here. So this is about information security, but the concept can very easily be applied to the GDPR, where you have this initial buy-in stage to deliver sort of short, punchy facts and get people to buy into the GDPR through the consequences as well as the benefits. And by delivering this in a really highly visual format, you are likely to reach all your employees, including the sort of shop floor workforce. So again, here's an example of using the consequences as a potential driver for buy-in. So next, there would be delivering knowledge. So once you have achieved this motivational factor, it's important to educate them on what the GDPR is all about. And this isn't the focal point of this webinar, but it's still an important consideration because understanding of it will ultimately help to mitigate aversion. One example of this is simply e-learning. So you should provide your workforce with a high-quality learning solution, whether it is through face-to-face training or online learning, to help them understand the implications of the GDPR and how it will affect them in their daily roles. Next, it's important to encourage knowledge transfer to the workplace. So it is not enough to know what best practice involves really, but they need to apply their obtained knowledge in their everyday activities. And again, here we return to the idea of this gap between knowledge retention and application, which has become apparent in a lot of research recently. So it's important to give your workforce sort of worked examples and scenarios wherein they can identify, for example, different actors, where they can apply the GDPR in a context that is realistic to their own role. So one example can be activities and scenarios. These should be meaningful and encourage deep reflection. So they should be relevant. They should make learners active participants by challenging them to recall key information in relevant contexts. And they should prompt participants to identify risks and apply best practice. Here's an example from one of our e-learning courses, where they have to read through this scenario and identify the different roles according to the information given. And I think this really takes it from the knowing to the doing stage, where people really have to reflect and apply the different principles and the knowledge about the GDPR. Finally, there's evaluation. Again, this is all too often neglected. The idea of effectively measuring success and continuously monitoring progress, so that everybody has the required level of knowledge and understanding. And having an effective evaluation will give participants an objective and sense of accomplishment as well. So there should be some sort of reward if possible. It can be a prize draw, or it can simply be a certificate, but just anything that can act as a motivator for participants. It will serve as a useful recap to consolidate information, and ultimately it can also provide a reliable audit trail to confirm that everybody has obtained this knowledge. Here's an example of an introductory screen of one of our evaluations for the GDPR, which consists of an engaging quiz challenge that learners can take after having gone through the training. Finally, continuous reinforcement should be the final but ongoing point on your GDPR awareness program agenda. So once the program is finished, it is important to ensure that the GDPR remains at the forefront of individuals' minds. So while it is important to generate a big initial impact and to get people's attention, it is just as important to keep people's attention and to keep your workforce engaged with the subject in the long term, because a breach may not occur now, but the GDPR is here to stay, so it can always occur in the future, and therefore you should refresh your interventions on a regular basis. And there are different ways of doing this as well. So one example would be a learning nudge, what we call a learning nudge based on nudge theory, meaning that it wouldn't necessarily have to be obligatory to complete, but it would nudge participants into wanting to complete it, or into almost thinking they voluntarily want to learn more about the GDPR and want to make sure they adhere to it. There are many different techniques and strategies to do this, again, through your internal communications or your learning and development department. And finally, some useful references. So we have got a number of publications from the CIPD, so that's the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And again, this is more of an HR resource, and compliance managers may not necessarily be familiar with it, but it's very useful and important to get up to speed with change management techniques, communications, and they also have a publication about the GDPR in the workplace. Then we have got the international equivalent of this, where you can also kind of connect with other change management experts. We obviously have the ICR, and finally we've got IT governance and our blog, which is a really useful resource with regular publications on how to get your workforce up to speed, how to get everyone engaged, and really generate lasting impact. So finally, we've come to the end of the session, and the conclusion I really want you to take away from this, or the key takeaways, can be boiled down to effective planning and diverse involvement. So the talked earlier, and the idea of getting many different parties involved. And while obviously there is a pressing need and a deadline for generating awareness, it is important to manage it in a way that involves different parties from around your business, where different specialists can contribute using their proven tools from other areas, such as internal communications. We have employee engagement and motivation, so that was the buy-in we talked about earlier, meaning that you should use as many channels as possible to get participant buy-in, learner buy-in. And then finally, continual monitoring and refreshing. So this idea of not simply ticking staff awareness and the GDPR off your list, but having it there as a sort of continuous project which you monitor and refresh. And finally, as mentioned, we have some really useful resources, and in order to stay up to date, you can join us on LinkedIn or Facebook or different channels. You can call IT governance and get some help and advice, or let us talk you through your specific situation and how perhaps one of our consultants could help. Now, finally, questions, any queries? I'm just going to see if there are any questions. Okay, so we have one question saying, I would love to hear more about learning nudges. So that's a very good question. Learning nudges, and let me just show you a brief example of a learning nudge. If we look into this different presentation, we can see an example of a learning nudge in which participants are sort of challenged to defend their organization against potential breaches or potential, because this is an information security example, potential hackers where the threat has really been personified. And the idea is that this nudge would be sent out quite a while after your core awareness intervention, meaning that people may not necessarily have the GDPR at the forefront of their mind. And it would have to be a kind of opt-in choice which people make, but are highly encouraged to make. So for example, there could be a prize draw involved, or there could be highly engaging persuasive language. So there are many different ways to sort of nudge people into making the right decision and follow up on training. I will just briefly show you an example of a learning nudge. If we look into this presentation, we have an example of a learning nudge, which is a gamified quiz challenge, where people need to protect their organization against this potential hacker by using their knowledge. And because it has many different elements of gamification and it's considered highly engaging, this sort of nudge will make its way around the organization and really gain interest and buy-in from your learners, and it will just act as a reminder that you have to apply your knowledge on a daily basis. So that's about learning nudges. One second. Another question. I deal with company mobiles. I want to know more about how it affects company mobiles. How can I bring it into the conversation as not 100% clued up on it? So there are many different ways of delivering a campaign to mobiles. If you're asking about mobile policies under GDPR, then you would have to get in touch with one of our GDPR consultants. Whereas if you're talking about awareness campaign deployment to mobiles, then there are many useful authoring tools and also mobile-ready courses which you can simply deliver using our platform or your own in-house platform. Again, I think this is a conversation where the individual asking the question could perhaps contact one of our advisors and tell them more about your technical infrastructure and your specific context and requirements, because I'm sure we have dealt with many requirements like this in the past and can help you out. Moving on. Okay, so the next question would be, hi, just wondering if you have a GDPR compliance checklist that helps achieve compliance and identifies gaps within organizations. So on one hand, if we are talking about the GDPR in general, we offer a gap analysis and we offer many different tools for DPIAs and other things. However, if you're talking about engaging your workforce and getting everybody on board, then we have a learning needs analysis which we can carry out. Again, this makes use of qualitative as well as quantitative ways of measuring your organization's current level of engagement and motivation and existing knowledge regarding the GDPR. And it also identifies a number of objectives and sort of targets to set yourself going forward on your awareness journey. It will usually put forward a number of recommended solutions which you can either develop internally or again outsource. And IT governance also have a really vast portfolio of different solutions to address this. Okay, another question here. If we deliver staff awareness training to all employees, how often should it be repeated? It's not so much about repeating the staff awareness training itself, although repetition can be a very effective driver for knowledge retention and also understanding. It is not necessarily the most engaging method of really getting your personnel to work for you on the subject and to be engaged with the subject. So while it is recommended to repeat training on an annual basis, and obviously for new joiners, inductions and things like that, there is no one-size-fits-all formula. And what I would personally recommend are, again, as mentioned, small learning nudges delivered in really concise formats. So really short bursts, even on a monthly basis. This can be done in the form of a newsletter, including it in your regular communications. And if you adopt that type of long-term approach, I think it will be far more likely to ingrain itself in your organization's DNA, rather than simply mechanically repeating your staff awareness training on a 6-month basis or something like that. Are you having the toolkit to do the GDPR assessment, or what baseline can we take as an approach? So IT governance offers the GDPR staff awareness assessment along with its online learning module. And the advantage of this particular course is that all the content has actually been put together by GDPR experts, real data protection and legal experts with a number of years of experience, including GDPR qualifications, PhDs with research focus on the GDPR. So ultimately, that means that the assessment we offer really ensures that all areas that have to be tested will be tested. There was a section in the slide which mentioned the 12 steps to take to kick off GDPR within the organizations, but it didn't have the 12 steps. No, it didn't have the 12 steps because in this particular webinar, we focus on staff engagement and staff awareness. And the remaining steps deal with other aspects of the GDPR. But the reason why this slide was included was to reinforce the importance of staff awareness and staff engagement, because the ICO mentions it as their very first point, or their very first step in the 12 steps to take. So you can find that on their website and you can have a look through it, and you may also find the other steps useful. Have you had any experience on dealing with resistance from management due to budget issues on the cost of the implementing GDPR? Honestly, I have had experience with resistance of employees, but not so much senior managers. And I think if you do experience resistance from senior managers, it is really enough to logically list the consequences of non-compliance and the consequences of a lack of awareness in budgetary terms as well. So you can look at the budget you have available or the budget you are asking for and compare that to the potential fines or the potential consequences of non-compliance to the organization. And I'm sure you can make a really compelling case in that way to invest more in staff awareness and the GDPR in general. So I have not had any experiences with management resistance, more with staff resistance. But again, we can have a conversation about this if you contact IT governance. What are the mandatory points to be taken care while making the scope? If you are referring to the scope of your awareness program, there are no specific recitals or articles that refer to the scope of an awareness program, but there are sort of guidelines and best practices. When scope is a very broad term, actually, it can be the scope and budget, the scope and duration, the scope in many other ways. So again, if you could specify maybe a little bit and get some in touch with IT governance directly. Next question, in a B2B relationship, i.e. in a merger and acquisition scenario, do you have any tips on consideration with engagement? Oh, this is a very interesting one. I'm glad you asked this. So you will obviously have a whole array of different issues to address when it comes to staff engagement and management when you have a merger and acquisition scenario. So you should maybe approach the GDPR from a similar perspective and work with your change managers to kind of conceive the right solutions. So I think it's very important not to undermine the existing culture of an organization. So never try to impose your existing awareness techniques or interventions, even including things like the brand. So when you are going through this kind of process, you will often experience a rebrand, a complete change in culture, change in tone of voice, and many other things. But you should try to do this sequentially rather than in one big burst. So when you deploy a GDPR awareness piece to this type of audience, you should make sure to perhaps keep it as neutral as possible, and also take into account general change management considerations. How should we position the seriousness of, i.e. a data breach? The GDPR makes these issues feel really bad, but in reality we need staff to be afraid of talking about a breach. How do we encourage staff to talk about issues instead of ignoring them? Oh, again, that's a very good point. And that is one of the reasons why I am personally not necessarily a fan of scare tactics and always pushing the consequences of non-compliance as a motivator. A really kind of effective way is to leverage your existing internal communication channels. So perhaps your Microsoft Office channels, you have different places like Yammer or like Teams, where people could set up their own, either department specific or company wide, depending on your setup and needs, their own communications channels where they can address sort of gray areas or any concerns they may have. You should always encourage conversation. So start a campaign about having a chat, have a data chat, have a GDPR chat, and include this, as I mentioned, in your regular communications and regular updates. So things like frequently asked questions, common misconceptions, and again, depending on the culture of your organization, you can deliver these in a really almost fun, engaging format, using sort of common new media techniques and formats with imagery, a more informal kind of tone of voice, a more informal channel. so that people don't feel scared of having a chat and talking about these issues and mitigating them before they arise, really. I have a question. Okay, that's all it says. If you have a question that you would like to perhaps discuss in private and you don't want to post it on here, you can always contact our service centre and they will be more than happy to have a conversation and address any questions. I would like to know what it is for an individual employee in their daily job. So the reason why I didn't give a specific example, because it is so diverse. So depending on what kind of role you are in, you could deal with a whole range of different types of personal data, or you could deal with very limited amounts of personal data. So obviously, if you work in IT or HR, the implications on your daily role and things like contributing to risk registers and things will be much more extensive than somebody who works on a manufacturing line and doesn't really see much information at all. So I think, again, that is to be determined on an individual organizational level. Can you give a brief example of how fines might be alleviated, or levied against an organization due to a breach of the GDPR? So again, this would be a GDPR consultant who has to address this. But as mentioned, you can contact IT governance and they can put you in touch with the right person. Can you please explain a bit more on Privacy Shield? Again, this is actually this features in our training course itself, and you would be better off contacting a GDPR specific consultant. Oh, someone asked me last week for a certified GDPR implementer. Do I guess IT governance have such certification training? Yes, we have a number of certified training courses which can lead you to progress your career to becoming a data protection officer. So we have a foundation course and then a practitioner course, and the practitioner course is a real in-depth applied kind of GDPR training, focusing on real application in many different ways and scenarios. So that stretches across multiple days. And you can again find more information about this on our website. Raising awareness. Does the same level of awareness have to be raised with staff as well as students, for example, in the college? You obviously, the scope of the GDPR also stretches across different ways in the supply chain and different areas like that. So again, I think this would be a specific question that a GDPR consultant would need to address. Are there any other examples in which we can make the GDPR seem less dry than games? I think there are many examples. I think one really effective and proven way is the simple idea of using different characters. So you could have, for example, interviews with existing employees, their views and their misconceptions, and simply communicate that via email if it is nicely stylized and designed, it can capture people's attention, and it puts a subject which is perceived as dry and a language also which is very regulation-like into a more easygoing context, a more personal context, and more applied context as well. In addition, you could use other characters. You could have, for example, one of our clients likes to use animals or things like that. So depending on your audience and perhaps what you find effective or patronizing, there are many, many different ways. And again, if you give us a call, we can have a chat about different techniques. Okay, that's an individual question with an email address. Can we have a copy of the slides? Yes, of course you can. They will be sent out, as I mentioned at the beginning. And I think we have reached the end. So the user interface of this tool is not very intuitive. So if I have missed anything, please get in touch and we will do our best to answer your questions. And this is the end of our session today. Thank you for listening.